In this section, we're going to study something called changes in consumer surplus. The motivation for looking at this is that the world changes all the time, and we want to know what is the impact of such changes on consumer well-being. So to make this explicit, consider a concrete example, which is what happens when prices decrease from an initial level of P0 to a final level of P1. We're going to call the change in consumer surplus from P0 to P1, and I'm going to denote it by that, as the difference in consumer surplus at P1, the final one, minus consumer surplus at P0, the initial one. Notice that this has a very nice interpretation. This difference is precisely the change in experience utility produced by the price. Now, there is an easy way to see why that is the case, why this interpretation is correct. Remember what CS of P1 was. This, I'm just going to write it out, was the utility at P1, basically, just using a shortcut, minus the utility of no trade. Was the consumer surplus P1 was the gains from going from no trade to trade at price P1. Now we know that this, and I'm going to write it down, is the utility of trade at P0 minus the utility of no trade again. When we take the difference, these two things cancel, and what we get is that the difference in consumer surplus is exactly the difference in the level of experience utility at the final price minus the initial price. Now let's see how to represent the change in consumer surplus graphically. So we go to our usual diagram, in which we have prices in the y-axis, x in the x-axis, we have the marginal benefit function. And we know, I'm going to use different colors, that initially when we are at a high price like P0, the consumer surplus at P0 is given basically by that area, that is CS at P0. Now, when we lower the prices, let's say to P1 here, by the similar logic, we see that the consumer surplus now is all of this. And we see also, of course, that when the price goes down, the consumer surplus goes up, since the first area is contained in the second one. Now, what's the difference? The change in consumer surplus is this trapezoid, or this quasi, not exactly a trapezoid, depending on the curvature here, but it's quasi-trapezoid. That thing in red is the change in consumer surplus from P0 to P1. Now, it is useful to write down explicitly what this area is because it provides a lot of intuition. And we're going to do that as follows. Let X star 0 be the demand at P0. I'm writing it slightly different than before just to simplify the notation. You will see why in a second. And let X star 1 be the demand at P1, which is of course higher. Now, what is the change in consumer surplus from P0 to P1? Is of course going to be the area of this trapezoidal looking thing. Now notice that we can divide that area into two regions. This rectangle looking thing that I'm going to call A, and this quasi-triangular thing that I'm going to call B. And now let's write what both of those things are. Let me call this difference in prices delta P. It's just how big is that gap. So notice that the area of A is simply X star of 0, the demand at P0 times delta P. And notice that the area of B is given by the integral from X star of 0 to X star of 1, of the area between these two curves, which is the area between B prima and P dx. Now, it turns out that these two terms have a very nice economic interpretation. Think about what they mean. What happens when prices go down from P0 to P1? What happens is that you still get the original consumer surplus, but in addition, your surplus for those first X0 star units has gone up because you get to buy them at a cheaper price. So you can think of this as the value of buying X star 0, which is the original demand, at cheaper price. Now, think about what this second term means, this area. Well, not only you are consuming X star of 0, your consumption is going up to X star 1. So what that extra stuff is the value of buying X1 star minus X star of 0, this extra amount at P1. It's the surplus generated by the ability to buy that extra amount at P1. By the way, I apologize, there was a typo here. This should have been a P1 because we are integrating between this curve and that curve.